Welcome back. Today we are taking on a concept that feels simple on the surface start, but it's actually one of the most contentious and philosophically charged debates in all of Western thought. We are not here to talk about museum wings or the latest gallery opening.
No, not at all.
We're going straight to the core of what it means to make something, to create.
And we're looking at art as one of the foundational great ideas, a concept that has been seen as powerful, dangerous, and absolutely essential to being human for thousands of years.
And it's worth noting, for this particular analysis of the source essay, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, and it's really designed for a deeper, more dynamic kind of analysis.
Exactly, to give you the clearest and most complete understanding we can.
So let's get into it. When we talk about art on this kind of philosophical scale using this Syntopicon tradition, what are we really talking about?
Well, the scope is huge. In this tradition, art is one of 102 great ideas. It's defined as the human power to make intelligent, ordered representations.
Ordered representations? Okay.
But crucially, the sources classify art as a mode of making, a productive science, if you will, not a mode of knowing. And that distinction right there sets the entire stage.
So it's this power to put form onto matter, and that matter could be anything, right? It could be physical, like marble or paint.
Or it could be something much less tangible, like words or sound or even digital code today.
The core idea we're working with here is that art can both imitate and transform reality. It's aiming for meaning, for pleasure, and sometimes, this is the important part, for moral or civic insight.
And that transformation piece is really the philosophical hook. Art, in this view, is never passive. It's an intentional, a purposeful intervention into the world.
It has weight.
It has immense weight because it can either show us truth and order, or it can cleverly hide it. And this ability to shape our emotions, and by extension, our character, our politics, that's why someone like Plato was so afraid of it.
It sounds like the whole fight over art is really a fight for control over the human soul.
I think that's a perfect way to put it.
This dual capacity, for revealing truth on one hand and for deceiving on the other is what makes it so philosophically important and, I guess, so morally tricky.
Absolutely. And Western thought frames this whole debate around a central tension that starts right at the beginning with two absolute giants of Greek philosophy.
Plato and Aristotle.
The two colossal poles of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, you have the Platonic suspicion of art. He lays it out most fiercely in the Republic. He sees art as fundamentally an illusion, a lie that misleads the soul and ultimately weakens the state.
And on the other side,
you have his student, Aristotle, with a defense. The view that art is a natural, it's an educative form of imitation that is actually psychologically necessary. It helps us understand universal truths.
To really get a grip on the importance of art, we have to start with the accuser, with Plato. You can't really appreciate the defense until you understand why he was so deeply suspicious of it.
I agree. This wasn't just a matter of taste for him. He saw it as a genuine moral and political threat. And his critique in the Republic is the foundation for everything that comes after.
So let's get into that. Let's start with his big metaphysical charge, that devastating phrase. Art is a copy of a copy. Where does an artwork even fit into Plato's famous hierarchy of reality?
Okay, so Plato's whole philosophy, especially his theory of forms, is built on this hierarchy of being. You might remember the allegory of the cave.
Right, the shadows on the wall.
Exactly. So at the very top, the highest level of reality, you have the intelligible forms. These are the perfect, eternal blueprints for everything. The form of justice, the form of beauty, or in his famous example, the form of the bed. This is true reality, and you can only grasp it with your intellect.
And then one step down from that.
One step down is the sensible, physical world we live in. All the objects and sounds we see and touch every day. This world, for Plato, is already an imperfect, constantly changing imitation of those perfect forms.
So a real physical bed that a carpenter builds is just a flawed copy of that perfect, ideal form of the bed.
Precisely. The carpenter is at least trying to make something useful, following the form as best he can. He's looking toward the ideal.
But then the artist comes in, third in line.
Goes in line, and that's the problem. The artist, say, a painter making a painting of that bed, is imitating the physical object. He's imitating what the carpenter made.
He's imitating the imitation.
He is. So the artwork is twice removed from the objective truth of the forms.
So if we go back to the cave analogy, the philosopher's job is to drag people out of the cave, toward the light, toward the forms.
Yes.
But the artist is down there in the cave, painting more, maybe even better looking, shadows on the wall, convincing people to stay and watch.
That's the insidious nature of it. The conclusion Plato draws from this is severe. Art is fundamentally deceptive. It relies on superficial appearance, not on real knowledge. The painter doesn't need to know anything about carpentry or the form of the bed.
He just needs to know how to make it look like a bed.
He just needs to fool the audience. This is so important for you to grasp. This isn't Plato just disliking bad art. It's a deep, structural distrust of the entire artistic process, because for him it fails at the most important task, which is revealing true reality.
It just shows you shadows of shadows.
And that metaphysical problem leads directly to a much more practical, and for him, more urgent one.
No.
The moral and political corruption he feared it would cause in his ideal state.
Because if art is so far from the truth, what does it use to persuade people?
Emotion. Pure sensory appeal.
And that's the danger he talks about in the Republic when he's designing the education for the guardians, the city's rulers and soldiers.
Yeah.
He argues that powerful art, especially poetry and drama, works by stirring up the lower, irrational parts of the soul.
Things like pity, fear, excessive grief, lust, even uncontrollable laughter.
For Plato, a virtuous person and a well-run city depend completely on the rule of reason, the rational part of the soul, what he called logos.
Right. The soul has to be ordered, with reason guiding our spirit and keeping our appetites in check.
But art just bypasses reason completely. It makes a direct appeal to those other parts of the soul. So if you're a citizen constantly watching tragedies that encourage you to feel overwhelming grief, or comedies that make you laugh hysterically at foolishness, you're practicing being irrational. You're training your soul to be disordered. This disorder in the individual citizen will eventually cause disorder in the whole state. He literally says art waters the passions, making them grow when they should be starved.
And this is what he called the habituation risk. He was worried that artists corrupt people by showing them flawed heroes, or even gods behaving badly. He specifically calls out Homer for showing gods who weep or act out of spite.
Absolutely. If your state allows stories that show gods and heroes as cowardly or unjust, it just rots the moral fabric of the city. The young guardians are being molded by these stories. If the stories are bad, the guardians will be bad.
This connects so directly to our world today. I mean, you have to ask yourself, does the media we consume, the shows, the news, the social media feeds, does it train our feelings? And if it does, what habits are we learning? That's the question. Are we being habituated to feel constant outrage, maybe? Or shallow sentimentality? Does this stop us from doing the slow, hard work of rational thinking and civic discourse?
If the answer to that is yes, then Plato's fear that art is just a tool for political distraction is incredibly relevant to our, completely image-saturated world.
Which is why he insisted on regulation, on censorship, really.
Right. The power of art is undeniable, but because he sees it as tending toward deception and disorder, he doesn't say no art, he says regulated art. It has to be strictly controlled by the philosopher kings.
That's the nuance, yes. He bans most of what we would call the mimetic arts, especially tragedy and comedy, where you're acting out different characters and appealing to those base emotions. But he does allow certain forms, as long as they're perfectly aligned with the state's goals.
So what made the cut? What was the approved art for his ideal city?
Well, the list is short. Hymns to the gods, and encomia, which are basically songs of praise for virtuous men. In music, he allows only two modes: the Dorian, which he thought represented courage, and the Phrygian, which encouraged temperance.
And he banned all the others.
All the others. He thought the Lydian mode, for example, was too relaxing, too emotional. For Plato, art must serve the state. It must serve education and civic harmony. It has to be politically useful and morally simple.
So to sum up Plato then, art is dangerous. It looks like truth, but it's twice removed from reality, and it encourages irrationality by feeding the lower parts of the soul. Therefore, the state must control it, censor it, to protect the citizens and the city.
That's it, which sets the stage perfectly for the great defender of art, Aristotle, who takes the very thing Plato fears most, imitation, and makes it the foundation of his argument.
It's just amazing. Aristotle, Plato's own student, takes Plato's weapon, this idea of mimesis or imitation, and he turns it completely on its head. He makes imitation a sign of intelligence, not deception.
He absolutely does. He agrees with the basic premise. Art is mimetic. It is a representation of actions, of characters, of events. But for him, That's not a flaw. It's not a political threat. It's a natural, necessary, and frankly, wonderful human instinct.
So where does this positive view of imitation come from?
Aristotle argues that imitation is one of the very first ways that we learn. Think about children. We are, by our nature, the most imitative of all animals. It is a fundamental cognitive process. It's how we acquire knowledge about the world.
And he connects this act of imitation directly to pleasure, both in the making of it and in the watching of it.
He does. It's tied to the pleasure of learning and recognition. When you see a skillful imitation, a good painting or a play, you feel pleasure, not because the thing itself is necessarily pleasant to look at.
You could be looking at a tragedy.
Exactly. The pleasure comes from engaging your mind. You're recognizing the representation, you're understanding the artist's skill, and you're learning something about the thing being imitated. You're figuring it out. And that process of figuring things out is inherently pleasurable for humans.
The shift here is just monumental. For Plato, mimesis is proof that the artist is a liar, leading us away from truth.
Whereas for Aristotle, mimesis is proof that the audience is engaged in an act of learning, pulling them toward knowledge.
And this cognitive benefit gets its most famous treatment in his analysis of tragedy, in the Poetics. He defines tragedy not just as a sad story, but as an imitation of a serious, complete action. And it has a specific beneficial goal.
Yes, the famous concept of catharsis.
Catharsis. Now, this is a word everyone knows, but almost everyone misunderstands. If it's not just, having a good cry to let off steam, what is actually happening emotionally?
That's the key distinction. Plato was worried about the inflation of passions, making people irrational. Aristotle argues for the exact opposite. He says tragedy produces a purification or maybe a clarification of the passions, specifically pity and fear.
A purification. So the emotions aren't just released, they're refined.
They're refined and they're managed. How does it do that? Well, tragedy structures the experience for you. You feel pity for a character who suffers more than they deserve. And you feel fear because you realize that a similar fate could befall you, someone like you.
And he uses the example of Oedipus, right? A great man who falls not because he's evil, but because of a fatal flaw, a mistake.
A great example. We pity Oedipus because his punishment is so far beyond his actual error. We fear because his situation reveals a universal vulnerability. By experiencing these incredibly intense emotions in a controlled, structured way in the theater, we're basically exercising our emotional muscles.
So it's a kind of emotional intelligence training.
That's a great modern term for it. Tragedy allows us to confront these powerful, potentially chaotic feelings in a safe space. The audience is trained to respond fittingly, with the right proportion, to terrible events.
So instead of making us irrational, as Plato feared, it makes us emotionally informed, more measured, better citizens even.
It makes us better equipped for real civic life, which is the exact opposite of Plato's conclusion.
This whole structure, the plot, the character, the catharsis, it gives art a kind of philosophical role that completely rejects Plato's copy of a copy dismissal. Aristotle says good art is more than just a record of what happened.
It's so much more. This is maybe the deepest difference between how Aristotle saw poetry and how he saw, say, history. For him, history is limited to the particulars. It just tells you what has happened.
For example, it tells you that Alcibiades lost a specific battle on a specific Tuesday for some specific reason.
Right. It's just facts. But poetry, or great drama, deals with what could or ought to happen. It deals in probabilities and necessities. It reveals universal truths about human nature. The playwright doesn't care about what Alcibiades did on one Tuesday. He cares about what happens, universally, when a man of great ambition and pride makes a fatal error.
So art, by exploring these universals, actually becomes, in his words, more philosophical than history.
More philosophical and more serious. History gives you the particular facts. Art gives you insight into the deep, causal structure of the moral universe.
So that's the core of the defense. For Aristotle, art is a rational structure that teaches us about cause and effect. It helps us become better people, not by lecturing us like Plato wanted, but by training our emotions to respond appropriately, to internalize the consequences of human action on a deep gut level.
It doesn't inflate the passions, it structures and purifies them. This allows reason to stay in control, but a reason that is emotionally intelligent. It's a beautiful, cohesive framework that really elevates both the artist and the audience. Before we jump into how later thinkers, tried to resolve this huge split between Plato and Aristotle, this fundamental fight over whether art is a lie or a teacher, let's just pause for a second. If you enjoy this kind of deep analytical content where we pull from different sources to give you the full picture, consider checking out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel. It's full of AI analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire, well, reflection and rational thought. Now, let's get back to how this great idea evolved over the centuries.
That tension is just fascinating. Art as a dangerous lie versus art as necessary emotional education. It really defined the entire conversation for the next 2,000 years. So what happened when the classical world gave way to new religious frameworks, particularly Christianity? How did they handle these ancient ideas?
Well, the medieval period brought a really significant theological overlay to the whole debate. For Christian writers like, say, Augustine or Aquinas, the big shift was integrating the idea of creativity into their understanding of God.
So the artist is now seen in relation to God the Creator.
Exactly. God is the ultimate artisan, the ultimate creator who brings form out of nothing. So human artistic making and even just the appreciation of beauty started to be seen as a reflection of that divine creativity.
So the very act of making something beautiful becomes an inherently good thing, a way to mirror the divine act of bringing order to the cosmos.
Precisely. It elevated the act of creation. It really affirmed Aristotle's idea of the importance of giving form to matter. The artist becomes almost a junior partner in creation, demonstrating rationality and order.
That sounds incredibly positive for the artist, almost a complete victory for the Aristotelian view.
It was very positive in one sense. But the Platonic caution never went away. In fact, it often came back with a vengeance. This time it took the form of intense warnings against images that could mislead the soul, or even worse, encourage idolatry.
The fear that people will start worshiping the image instead of the divine reality it's supposed to point to.
Exactly that. That tension was at the heart of huge conflicts, like the iconoclast debates. If you have a beautiful religious icon, does its beauty guide the soul toward God, or does it become an object of worship itself, trapping the soul with a physical copy?
It's the same old dual capacity, just in new terms. Art can reveal or it can mislead. It can be a path to spiritual truth or a dangerous distraction.
The arguments are almost identical. Plato's metaphysical danger and Aristotle's moral purpose, they're both still there. Just the context has shifted from the political health of the city to the eternal fate of the soul.
It's amazing how the debate just transforms. It never really ends. So what was the next big shift? I assume it comes with the Enlightenment, when the focus moves from God or the state onto the individual.
That's the one. We move into the era of modern aesthetics with thinkers like Kant and Hegel, and then the Romantic and Modernist movements. This is where art really starts to acquire its own independence, its autonomy.
So its value is now seen as something separate from its moral or religious or political usefulness.
Yes, its value becomes inherent. This is a huge break. The focus shifts in two ways. First, inward, to the artist's personal genius and subjective experience. Expression becomes a primary goal. The artist is now valued for their originality, for showing us their inner world, not just for imitating the external one.
And the second shift.
Second shift is outward, toward the work's form. Thinkers like Kant introduced this idea of disinterested pleasure.
Disinterested pleasure. So you appreciate the beauty of a thing without caring if it's morally good or useful, or even if it's a correct imitation of something real.
Exactly. You appreciate the composition, the colors, the internal logic of the work itself, purely for the aesthetic buzz it gives you. It doesn't matter if a statue is of a hero or a villain. What matters is the quality of its form. This is really the birth of art for art's sake.
Which is a radical departure from the classical world, where art was almost always judged by its utility, how well it educated citizens, or how accurately it represented reality.
A total departure. Now, a non-representational painting can be a masterpiece because of its color and balance, or an abstract sculpture for its form, regardless of what it's about.
But even with this idea of autonomy, the old debate doesn't really go away, does it? Critics are still arguing about what art's highest purpose is.
It never goes away. Is it truth? Is it moral improvement? Is it pure expression? Or is it just aesthetic play? It seems we didn't get rid of Plato and Aristotle. We just internalized their arguments and turned them into different schools of aesthetic criticism.
So the modern critic who demands that art should challenge political power is sort of echoing Aristotle's concern for civic life.
And the critic who insists that what matters is the formal purity of a work, divorced from its subject, is echoing Kant. We've inherited the whole spectrum of ideas, and now we have to apply it to a world that would have been unimaginable to any of these thinkers.
Right. We're not just talking about plays and statues anymore. We have film, video games, AI-generated art, an endless stream of media.
And today's philosophy of art is trying to figure out how these new forms engage our minds, our emotions, and our societies in a world that is just completely saturated with images. When you analyze a viral video or a political ad, you are, whether you know it or not, asking the Platonic question.
Is this manipulating my emotions? Is this image, twice removed from reality, distracting me from what's actually going on?
And you're also asking the Aristotelian one, is this refining my understanding? Is this experience clarifying my pity and fear, helping me understand some universal truth about the world? The tools are new, but the fundamental fight is the same.
The source essay really emphasizes that exploring a great idea like art isn't just about collecting historical facts. It's about using this history to move toward wisdom.
That's the Adlerian framework, yes.
Yeah.
The whole point is to move up the ladder of understanding.
So how does this idea of art help us make that journey?
Well, it starts at the bottom rung with simple opinion.
Yeah.
Art is just personal taste. Or, I know what I like. It's a subjective view that there's nothing to really discuss.
But the history we've just gone through proves that's not true. It forces you to the next step.
Which is moving toward knowledge. This means you start to establish shared criteria. What makes one poem structurally better than another? What are the principles of good storytelling? You move beyond, I like it, and start defining objective standards.
And from knowledge, we move to understanding.
Understanding is where you synthesize all the big theories. You see how mimesis, expression, and form all work together. You realize that a truly great work of art often succeeds on all three levels at once. It represents something truthfully, it expresses a feeling powerfully, and it has a beautiful internal structure.
And the final step is wisdom.
Wisdom is the highest level. That's where you judge how art should serve human life, human flourishing. It requires you to weigh Plato's demand for civic order against Aristotle's defense of our emotional lives and decide what the ultimate purpose of creativity really is.
So the immediate takeaway for you, the listener, is that this entire 2,500-year-old fight over art is really a fight over one thing: mimesis, imitation. Is it a flawed lie, or is it an essential teacher?
That's the core conflict. Art is powerful because it imitates life, and we have to constantly question the purpose and the effect of those imitations on ourselves and our society.
Which gives you a very practical tool. The next time you encounter any piece of media, a movie, a song, a news story, don't just consume it, interrogate it with this ancient framework.
First, ask the Platonic question. Is this thing corrupting my reason? Is it just playing on my emotions? Is it presenting me with a beautiful lie that distracts me from a more important truth?
And then immediately ask the Aristotelian question. Is this thing purifying my emotions? Is it helping me practice pity and fear in a controlled way? Is it showing me a universal truth about the human condition that I couldn't get from just the facts?
Wrestling with those two questions is the essence of engaging philosophically with art. You're moving yourself up that ladder from passive opinion to critical wisdom.
Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with, one that builds directly on the source material. If art is about imposing form on matter to create meaning, and today that matter is often raw data, and the artist might even be an algorithm, what responsibility does the contemporary creator or even the AI creator have when it comes to truth, virtue, and the health of our civic life?
The matter might be different, but the moral stakes, as you say, are exactly the same. An excellent thought to ponder. The tools change. But that fundamental tension, the dual power of imitation to either illuminate or deceive, that's eternal.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis. We hope this exploration into the philosophical roots of art helps you see your world in a new light, always asking, is this a mirror to the truth, or is it just a very colorful distraction?
Click the link on screen for the in-depth essay summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.